They didn't know her name. They knew her cart. The squeak of its wheel on polished marble floors. 4:15 every morning, before the city even opened its eyes. Before the espresso machines hissed to life in the lobby cafe. Before the engineers arrived in their tailored coats, badges swinging, coffee in hand, already talking over each other about load calculations and deadlines. To them, she was a shape in grey, moving quietly between the glass walls of Callahan and Voss Structural Engineering, one of the most prestigious firms on the eastern seaboard. But in 6 hours, everything about that morning would change. In 6 hours, a bridge would groan under its own weight, cameras would swarm the building lobby, and the only person left standing between a public disaster and total collapse would be the woman nobody thought to ask. Her name was Maren Ellison, and in her back pocket, folded soft from age, was a single torn page from a leather notebook that didn't belong to any engineer with a diploma on the wall. It belonged to a man who never finished high school. Welcome! If you're here, chances are you love stories about the ones the world walks past. The quiet ones, the overlooked ones, the people everybody assumes have nothing to offer, right up until the moment they're the only ones who can save everything. This is one of those stories. It's about a promise made to a grandfather, a notebook nearly thrown in the trash, and a truth buried for 30 years that was about to come due. With interest. Stay with me, because by the end, you're going to understand exactly why some people spend a lifetime being underestimated, and exactly what happens when the world finally runs out of excuses to ignore them. 3 hours earlier, Maren had been on her knees in a third-floor supply closet, sorting through a decade of abandoned files that were supposed to be shredded before the Ash Grove Bridge ribbon cutting that afternoon. It was routine, boring even. Old blueprints, broken staplers, a coffee mug shaped like a hard hat, cracked down the side. And then, wedged behind a filing cabinet no one had moved in years, she found it. A notebook, cracked leather cover, corners gone soft and rounded from decades of being carried in a coat pocket. She knew it instantly, knew the smudge on the spine, knew the initials scratched into the back cover with a pocket knife. W.E. William Ellison, her grandfather. She hadn't touched this notebook since she was 11 years old, sitting on a porch in Ohio, watching an old man with grease-stained hands sketch load diagrams by lantern light and explain, patiently, why a bridge doesn't fail all at once, why it whispers first, in cracks and shifts, and sounds too quiet for most people to hear, long before it ever screams. She didn't get the chance to feel much of anything before a voice cut across the closet doorway. What is that? Some kind of antique? Preston Voss, 31 years old, junior partner, Ivy League ring still catching the light every time he gestured, stood in the doorway in a suit that cost more than Maren made in a month. He didn't wait for an answer. He reached past her, plucked the notebook from her hands like it was a piece of garbage clinging to a chair, and flipped through it with theatrical disdain. Some old man's chicken scratch. Probably belongs in the recycling, not gathering dust in my supply closet. He dropped it back into her lap. Not into her hands, into her lap, like she was a table. Cleaning crew's supposed to be gone by 6. Don't let me catch you rifling through firm archives again. He didn't know her name either. 6 years, and he'd never once asked. Maren said nothing. She never did. She'd learned, a long time ago, that some battles aren't worth fighting with words. They're worth fighting with proof. And proof, she was starting to suspect, was sitting right there in her lap, warm from her own hands, older than Preston Voss's entire career. She didn't know yet how right she was. By 7 a.m., the lobby of Callahan and Voss was a storm of raised voices. Structural engineers, real ones, credentialed ones, the kind with framed degrees and expensive watches, were huddled around a tablet showing live feed from the Ash Grove Bridge site, 40 minutes north, where inspection drones had caught something nobody wanted to see, 3 hours before the mayor, 2 senators, and half the regional press were set to arrive for the opening ceremony. A hairline stress fracture, not in the concrete, in the load-bearing truss itself. The exact kind of failure that didn't show up in any of Preston Voss's models. The models he'd personally signed off on 8 months earlier. The models that had made him the youngest partner in company history. "It's not possible," Preston kept saying, to anyone who'd listen, running a hand through hair that was, for the first time Maren had ever seen, not perfectly styled. "Our simulations accounted for every load variable. Every single one. Every variable except one nobody in that room had been taught to look for. Every variable except the one written in a shaking, self-taught hand on page 43 of a notebook that had almost gone in the trash that morning. A notebook now sitting, forgotten, in the front pocket of a grey uniform, tucked against the chest of a woman nobody in that lobby had thought to ask a single question. Maren stood at the edge of the room, mop still in hand, and listened to men twice her salary and half her actual understanding argue about a problem her grandfather had solved on paper 40 years before any of them were born. She thought about the porch, the lantern light, his voice, low and certain. "A bridge doesn't lie to you, Maren. It tells you exactly what's wrong. Most people just never learn how to listen." She set down the mop, and for the first time in 6 years working in that building, Maren Ellison walked toward the center of the room instead of around it. She didn't say anything grand. She didn't announce herself. She simply walked to the edge of the table where the tablet sat glowing with the drone footage, and she looked, really looked, at the crack running along the truss joint, and something in her chest went very still and very quiet, the way it used to when her grandfather would go silent over a blueprint, tracing a line with his finger like he was listening to it breathe. "That's not a construction floor," she said. The room didn't turn all at once. A few heads lifted, distracted, the way people look up when a bird hits a window, startled, more than curious. Preston Voss was the first to actually register that a voice had spoken, and when he saw who it belonged to, his mouth curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. "I'm sorry," he said, in the tone of a man repeating a joke back, to make sure everyone else had heard it too. "Did the cleaning staff just weigh in on our structural failure?" A ripple of laughter, thin and nervous, moved through a few of the junior engineers, the kind of laughter people give not because something is funny, but because it's easier than the silence of not knowing what else to do with 4 hours until a bridge full of dignitaries. Maren felt the heat of it against her skin, familiar as an old coat. She had felt this exact heat before, 30 years ago, in a classroom where a teacher told her grandfather, standing in the doorway in his work boots, that self-taught men had no business correcting a licensed drafting instructor. She didn't flinch then. She didn't flinch now. "It's a resonance fracture," she said, louder this time, steady enough that the laughter behind her curled up and died on its own. "Not a load failure. Look at the pattern. It's branching outward from a single point near the second support pier, not spreading evenly along the stress line the way a pure weight failure would. That's vibrational. Something's making that truss hum at a frequency it wasn't built to handle." For a moment, nobody spoke. Preston's jaw tightened, the practiced calm of Ivy League boardrooms flickering, just slightly, at the edges. "With respect," he said, each word clipped. "I have a master's from Cornell, and I've never heard of anything like—" "You wouldn't have," Maren said. "It's not in the modern curriculum. It's old. Older than the software you're all staring at." At the back of the crowd, a door opened, and the room's temperature seemed to drop by 10 degrees, the way it always did whenever Anthony Callahan walked into a space. 62 years old, silver-haired, the Callahan half of Callahan and Voss, the man who'd built the firm from a 2-desk office 30 years earlier, and had watched, with a certain resigned exhaustion, as his late partner's son inherited half his name and none of his instincts. Callahan didn't raise his voice. He never had to. "Someone explain to me," he said, scanning the room, "why we have a bridge opening in 4 hours with a fracture nobody can identify, and why the loudest person in this conversation isn't one of my engineers." Nobody answered fast enough. Callahan's eyes landed on Marin, on the mop she'd left leaning against a pillar 20 feet away, on the grey uniform, on the notebook she was now holding against her chest, like something that might be taken from her a second time. "You have 30 seconds, he said. Not unkindly, not kindly either. Just the flat, appraising tone of a man who had learned, the hard way, decades ago, that arrogance in this business eventually got people killed, and he was too old and too tired to watch it happen again. Marin opened the notebook to a page she didn't need to search for. She'd known exactly where it was since the moment she saw the drone footage, since the moment the crack pattern matched a diagram burned into her memory since childhood. She turned it around and held it up, and there, in a shaking, uneven hand, 40 years old and yellowed at the edges, was a sketch of a truss joint nearly identical to the one on the tablet, with notes crowding the margins in tight, cramped handwriting. Wind-induced harmonic resonance. Occurs in long-span trusses, UFEV insufficient damping at secondary support points. Not always visible under static load testing. Reveals itself only under sustained directional wind at specific speeds. The kind you get off open water, off a river valley, off a coastline. Bridge doesn't fail from weight. It fails from singing the wrong note too long. "My grandfather wrote that in 1987, Marin said, into the silence that had swallowed the entire lobby. After a bridge he helped build in Oregon nearly came down during a windstorm. No injuries, thank God. But it scared him enough that he spent the next 2 years studying every case of it he could find. He never had a license. Nobody would give him one. He didn't have the degree, didn't have the connections, didn't have anyone willing to vouch for a man who learned engineering the way he learned everything else, by watching, by building, by getting it wrong until he got it right. So he wrote it all down instead. Every case study, every fix. He figured somebody, someday, might need it. Preston made a small, disbelieving sound in his throat. "You're telling me you want us to stake the reputation of this firm, to delay a bridge opening with the mayor and 2 senators standing on the ribbon, because of a hunch from a notebook that belonged to your grandfather?" "I'm telling you," Marin said, and for the first time her voice cracked, not with weakness, but with something closer to grief. 30 years of being told to be quiet, finally cresting all at once. That if you open that bridge at 2 o'clock this afternoon, and the wind off the valley hits that support pier at the wrong angle for longer than 90 seconds, that truss is not going to hold. And I would rather you call me a liar in front of everyone in this lobby than read about it on the news tonight. Callahan hadn't moved. His eyes had not left the notebook, not left the sketch, not left the careful, obsessive detail of a man's handwriting that clearly hadn't stopped working the problem for years after he'd written the first page. Something in his expression had shifted. Not belief yet, not fully, but the specific, dangerous curiosity of a man who had spent 30 years in this industry and had just seen something he'd never seen before. "Pull the wind data from the valley for the last 6 months, Callahan said, without turning around, to no one in particular, and everyone at once. Cross-reference it against her grandfather's resonance thresholds. Now, sir, with respect, we don't have time to entertain. I said now, Preston." The room moved. Fingers hit keyboards. A junior engineer near the back, young, nervous, the kind who hadn't yet learned to be cruel, was the first to actually take the notebook from Marin's hands, not to dismiss it this time, but to photograph the page, to start cross-checking numbers against the live simulation software with a kind of stunned, quiet urgency. Marin stood very still in the middle of it all, the mop forgotten 20 feet away, and felt, for one strange and unfamiliar moment, like the ground beneath her had shifted from something she'd spent 6 years standing quietly on the edge of, to something she was, for the first time, standing directly in the center of. Preston Voss watched her, arms crossed, jaw tight, a man visibly recalculating something he did not want to recalculate. He didn't apologize. Men like him rarely did on the first day. But his eyes kept drifting, again and again, back to the notebook in the junior engineer's hands, and to the woman in the grey uniform, who suddenly, infuriatingly, would not look away from him. Somewhere in the back of the room, a phone buzzed. Then another. Then 5 at once. The junior engineer at the terminal went pale, staring at his screen, and when he spoke, his voice barely carried across the room. "She's right," he said. "The wind data, it lines up, almost exactly. If that bridge opens at 2 o'clock, with these projected gusts, we're looking at sustained resonance well past her grandfather's 90-second threshold." Nobody laughed this time. Anthony Callahan finally turned to look at Maren directly, and for the first time since she'd started working there 6 years earlier, he asked her the one question nobody at Callahan and Voss had ever thought to ask. "What's your name?" "Maren," she said. "Maren Ellison." Callahan repeated it, quiet, like he was setting it down somewhere he wouldn't lose it again. "Ellison." He glanced at the notebook, then back at her face, and something shifted behind his eyes, recognition trying to surface through 30 years of sediment. "Any relation to a William Ellison? Worked structural steel up in Oregon, back in the 80s. Maren blinked. "That's my grandfather. You knew him. I knew of him." Callahan's voice had gone somewhere else, somewhere older. "Before I ever put my name on a building, I was a junior surveyor on a crew outside Astoria. There was a foreman everybody called the Professor. Didn't have a lick of formal training, but the union men trusted him more than they trusted half the engineers who signed the permits. Nobody would give him a license. Man saved a bridge crew from a bad pour once, caught a rebar spacing error the site engineer missed. Cost him nothing to speak up. Cost him everything, too. The engineer he corrected made sure he never got hired on a licensed crew again. He looked at the notebook like it had teeth. I always wondered what happened to him. He drove a delivery truck for the last 20 years of his life," Maren said. "Nights, he sat at the kitchen table and filled notebooks nobody asked him to fill. He used to say, 'Knowledge doesn't stop being true just because nobody's willing to pay you for it.'" The lobby had gone strange and hushed, the earlier chaos folding into something quieter, more watchful. Preston Voss stood near the tablet, arms still crossed, but his posture had changed. The confident sprawl of a man certain of his own competence had tightened into something smaller, more defensive. "Even if the wind data lines up," Preston said, "we can't cancel a bridge opening with 2 senators and a mayor already en route based on a hobbyist's notebook from 40 years ago. Do you understand the liability, the press implications, if we're wrong?" "Do you understand the liability?" Callahan said, without raising his voice. "If we're right, and we open it anyway." Preston didn't have an answer for that. Callahan turned to the junior engineer still hunched over the terminal, a young man named Devon, Maren would later learn, barely 2 years out of his own degree, still new enough to be more curious than territorial. "Run it again. Full resonance model. Using her grandfather's damping thresholds as the variable Preston's team missed." "I want a number, not a feeling." Devon's fingers moved fast. The room waited in a silence that had teeth of its own, the particular tension of people who suddenly understood that a wrong answer in either direction carried a cost. Wrong to trust the notebook and risk humiliation in front of the entire firm's leadership. Wrong to dismiss it and risk something far worse happening in front of cameras and senators at 2 o'clock. Maren used the silence to open the notebook again, farther in, past the Oregon Bridge, into pages she hadn't looked at in years. Her grandfather's handwriting changed slightly as the years went on, steadier in some places, shakier in others. Like a man writing through arthritis, he refused to complain about. She found the page she wanted, a follow-up entry, dated almost a full decade after the Oregon incident, where he'd refined his original theory after studying 2 more near failures he'd read about in trade journals he couldn't afford to subscribe to, and had photocopied instead at the public library. Fix isn't complicated once you know what you're looking for. Secondary damping brace, angled against the resonance axis, absorbs the harmonic before it builds past the threshold. Cheap, fast. Most engineers won't consider it because it isn't in their models. They're taught to calculate weight, not sound. But a bridge is a living thing. It moves. It breathes. You have to listen to it, not just measure it. She looked up. If the resonance risk is confirmed, there's a fix. A temporary damping brace at the secondary support point. My grandfather diagrammed the exact placement. It's not a redesign, it's a retrofit. Something that could theoretically be installed before 2 o'clock if your crew moves fast enough. Devon's head snapped up from the terminal. That's consistent with modern harmonic damping theory. We use similar bracing on suspension cables sometimes, just not on truss joints like this. It's unconventional, but the physics tracks. Preston made a short, disbelieving sound. You want to retrofit an active bridge 4 hours before a public ceremony based on hand sketches from a man who never passed an engineering exam in his life. He never took one, Marin said quietly. There's a difference between never passing and never being allowed to sit for it. Something in the way she said it landed harder than she expected. Callahan's jaw tightened, and for a moment Marin thought she saw, beneath 30 years of boardrooms and blueprints, the ghost of the young surveyor who'd once watched a good man get pushed out of an industry that had no room for people who didn't come with the right paperwork. "Run the retrofit numbers," Callahan said to Devon. "If it holds up structurally, I want a full engineering team dispatched to the bridge in the next 20 minutes. Preston, you're going with them." "Me?" Preston looked, for the first time all morning, genuinely alarmed. "Sir, if this is wrong, it's my name on the door, not yours," Callahan said. "And if it's right, I want the man who called it a hobbyist's notebook standing right there when we find out." Preston's mouth opened, then closed. He looked at Marin, really looked at her, maybe for the first time in 6 years, and something passed over his face that wasn't quite an apology, but wasn't quite the old contempt either. It was the look of a man realizing, in real time, that the ground he'd built his whole identity on might not be as solid as he'd assumed. The next 20 minutes moved fast. Devon's team confirmed the resonance projection with a number that made even Preston go quiet. A 94% probability of harmonic failure if the bridge opened as scheduled, with wind conditions holding at their current forecast. A structural crew was mobilized. Engineers and steelworkers pulled from 3 different job sites across the city, given an address and a diagram, and 45 minutes to make it happen. Marin watched them go, watched Preston climb into the lead vehicle, looking like a man walking into a courtroom he wasn't sure he'd win. Callahan lingered behind, in the emptying lobby, the mop still leaning forgotten against its pillar. He picked up the notebook Marin had set down on the table and turned through a few pages himself, slow and careful, the way a man handles something he's beginning to understand he underestimated. 6 years, he said, not quite looking at her. "You've worked in this building 6 years, and I never once asked your name." "Most people don't," Marin said. It wasn't bitter. It was just true, the way a fact is true, worn smooth by repetition. "That's going to change," Callahan said, "starting today." She didn't answer right away. Her eyes had drifted to the window, to the skyline beyond it, to the direction of the river where, in a few hours, one way or another, a truck full of engineers was about to find out whether a dead man's handwriting could hold up a bridge that a room full of licensed professionals had missed. He'd have liked this building, she said quietly, almost to herself. All this glass. He always said good engineering should feel invisible, like the building isn't fighting the world around it, just agreeing with it. Callahan looked at her for a long moment, and for the first time since she'd known him, 6 years of passing him in hallways, 6 years of him walking past her cart without a glance, he seemed to actually see her, not as the woman with the mop, but as the answer to a question he hadn't known he was still asking. "Miss Ellison," he said, "I think you'd better come with me to the bridge." The car Callahan called wasn't the sleek black sedan Marin expected from a man who ran a firm with his name etched in brass over the lobby doors. It was his own, a decade-old SUV with a coffee stain on the passenger seat and a faded parking pass from some engineering conference still clipped to the visor. He drove it himself, which surprised her more than it should have. "I don't like being chauffeured to job sites," he said, catching her glance. Man loses touch with what he's actually building if somebody else is always driving him there. They didn't talk much on the way north, the city thinning into overpasses and river bends, the Ash Grove Bridge rising ahead of them like something out of a postcard. All clean modern lines, cable stays catching the late morning light, banners already strung along the pedestrian rail announcing the ribbon cutting in bold county fair colors. From a distance, it looked flawless. So it was only up close, walking the access road behind Callahan with her grandfather's notebook pressed against her ribs, that Marin could see the crew already swarming the second support pier, cranes angled, harnesses clipped, Preston Voss standing at the center of it all, with a tablet in one hand and an expression that had lost every trace of its earlier certainty. "Talk to me," Callahan said, striding toward him. "Damping brackets fabricated and on site," Preston said, not looking up. "Devon's crew is running final stress simulations on the retrofit placement now. If her grandfather's numbers are right, we bolt it in at the secondary joint and it absorbs the resonance before it ever reaches critical amplitude." He glanced at Marin, and for the first time, there was no mockery in it, just something tight and unreadable. "If they're wrong, we've spent the last hour weakening a structurally sound bridge based on sketches from a man who wrote in pencil." "They're not wrong," Marin said. "You don't know that." "I know him," she said. "That's not the same as knowing math. But it's not nothing either." Preston opened his mouth to argue, then seemed to think better of it, some new caution finding its way into him that hadn't been there 4 hours earlier. He turned back to his tablet instead, and Marin watched him work. Watched, for the first time, not the arrogance of the man who'd dropped a notebook into her lap like garbage, but the fear underneath it, the fear of a young man who'd built his entire identity on being the smartest person in every room he walked into, now standing in a room where the smartest person had spent 6 years pushing a mop past his desk. Devon jogged over from the base of the pier, sweat cutting through the dust on his forehead, tablet clutched against his chest like a shield. Simulations clean. If we install at the exact point in the notebook, 41 degrees off the vertical axis, not the standard 45 the modern bracing charts would suggest, it should redirect the harmonic load before it ever compounds. He glanced at Marin, something like awe breaking through his exhaustion. Whoever wrote that notebook understood vibrational load transfer in a way our current curriculum barely touches. This is genuinely elegant work. He'd have liked hearing that, Marin said. Nobody ever told him that while he was alive. Callahan checked his watch. 11:40. 2 hours and 20 minutes until the mayor's motorcade was scheduled to arrive, until 2 senators and a wall of local press would be standing exactly where the crew now stood, until the fate of everything rested on whether a self-taught man's 40-year-old sketches could outthink a room full of licensed engineers armed with software he never got to touch. "Install it," Callahan said. The next hour felt like it happened both too fast and impossibly slow. Steelworkers moved with the practiced urgency of men who did dangerous things for a living and had learned not to let urgency become panic. Maren stood at the base of the pier with the notebook open in her hands, calling out measurements when Devon needed to double-check an angle, translating her grandfather's cramped, decades-old shorthand into numbers a modern crew could use. She hadn't expected this. Hadn't expected, after 30 years of keeping this notebook mostly to herself, that she'd spend an afternoon standing in the shadow of an actual bridge, being asked, again and again, by people who'd never given her the time of day, what her grandfather would have done next. It was strange how quickly the fear in her chest, the old, familiar fear of being laughed out of a room, had been replaced by something else. Not pride exactly, something quieter, recognition maybe, the particular ache of finally being seen for something she'd carried alone for a very long time. At 1:17, the final bolt was torqued into place. Devon ran the simulation one last time, live, cross-referencing the installed brace against the projected wind data for the ceremony window. The whole crew went quiet, gathered around his tablet, the only sound the wind picking up off the river, the very wind that, in less than an hour, was supposed to test whether a dead man's handwriting could hold up $100 million of modern engineering. Resonance risk, Devon said, voice tight, down to under 4%, well within safety margins. Somebody exhaled, loud enough to hear. A few of the steelworkers actually laughed, the sharp, relieved laughter of men who'd been holding their breath without realizing it. Preston didn't laugh. He stood very still, staring at the brace bolted into the pier, at the elegant, unassuming little fix that had just quietly solved a problem his Cornell degree hadn't seen coming. He walked over to Maren slowly, like a man approaching something he wasn't sure how to address. "I owe you an apology," he said. It came out stiff, unpracticed, like a language he wasn't fluent in. "You don't owe me anything," Maren said. "You just have to stop assuming you already know everything about a person before you've asked them a single question." Preston nodded, slow, chastened in a way that looked almost unfamiliar on him. He didn't say anything else. Some men needed more than one humbling moment to fully absorb the lesson, and Maren wasn't naive enough to think one bridge had rewritten 31 years of assumptions. But it was a start, a crack in something that had, until this morning, looked seamless. Callahan appeared at her shoulder, watching the crew begin their final safety sweep before the site was cleared for the ceremony. "You saved this firm's reputation today," he said. "You saved lives, potentially, and I still don't know a single thing about you beyond a name and a notebook." "There's not much to know," Maren said. "I raise my daughter. I clean this building at night, so I can be home when she gets off school. I've been doing that for 6 years, and before that, I did something similar in 3 other buildings just like it. And the notebook." She looked down at it, at the worn leather warm from her own hands, at the initials scratched into the back in a dead man's careful, deliberate hand. "He gave it to me the week before he passed, told me knowledge like this shouldn't die in a drawer somewhere just because nobody official ever validated it. I think, if I'm honest, I never really believed it would matter to anyone but me." Callahan looked out at the bridge, clean gleaming, banners snapping in the wind, less than an hour from a ceremony that would now go forward exactly as planned, with none of the assembled dignitaries ever knowing how close it had come to catastrophe or whose handwriting had quietly saved them from it. "It's going to matter to a lot more people than you think," he said, "starting this afternoon." The ceremony began exactly on schedule, which struck Maren as its own kind of small miracle. 2 hours earlier, this bridge had been 94% likely to fail in front of a crowd of thousands. Now it stood gleaming under a clean autumn sky, banners snapping in a wind that would have doomed it. Cordons set up along the pedestrian rail, a stage erected near the northern approach with a podium, a ribbon the size of a small parade float, and a scissor so large it looked more like a prop than a tool. Maren stood near the back of the crowd, out of her uniform now. Callahan had insisted she change into something from the site trailer's spare wardrobe, a plain navy blazer that fit awkwardly across her shoulders, but was, she had to admit, the nicest thing she'd worn to work in years. She felt strange standing among the crowd instead of moving quietly behind it. Strange and a little exposed, like the wrong side of a photograph had suddenly been turned to face the light. The mayor spoke first, the way mayors always did, a speech full of words like progress and vision and the future of our city's infrastructure, none of which mentioned that 4 hours earlier, this exact structure had a 94% chance of humming itself apart under the very wind now rippling the banners behind him. Then one of the senators spoke, shorter, more practiced, hitting the applause lines with the ease of someone who'd given 1,000 versions of the same speech in 1,000 different towns. Then Anthony Callahan took the podium. Maren hadn't expected him to deviate from the script. She'd assumed, the way she'd learned to assume, over 6 years of standing quietly at the edges of rooms like this one, that whatever had happened that morning would stay in that morning, filed away as an internal matter, the kind of thing firms quietly fixed and never publicly discussed. She'd have been fine with that. She hadn't done any of it for credit. But Callahan didn't follow the script. "Before I hand this ceremony back to the schedule," he said, his voice carrying easily over the crowd, "I want to tell you about something that happened in my office this morning. Something most of you will never read about in a press release, because frankly, we almost didn't have a bridge left to open." A ripple of confusion moved through the crowd. Somewhere near the front, Maren saw Preston Voss go very still. "4 hours ago," Callahan continued, "one of my engineer's models missed a structural risk in this bridge's design. A risk that, left unaddressed, could have caused a serious failure sometime during today's ceremony. It wasn't caught by any of my licensed structural engineers. It wasn't caught by any of the inspection software this firm has spent millions of dollars developing over 3 decades. He paused, letting the silence stretch just long enough to matter. "It was caught by a woman who has worked in my building for 6 years, cleaning the floors most of you are standing on right now. A woman none of my staff, myself included, had bothered to learn the name of until this morning." Maren felt her face go hot. Heads were turning now, scanning the crowd, and she had the sudden dizzying urge to disappear into the pavement. "Her name is Maren Ellison," Callahan said, "and the knowledge that saved this bridge today didn't come from a university. It came from her grandfather, William Ellison, a self-taught structural engineer who spent his life being told he wasn't qualified to sit in the rooms where decisions like this get made, despite understanding load dynamics better than half the licensed engineers I've worked with in 30 years in this industry. He wrote his life's knowledge down in a notebook, because nobody with a stamp of approval would ever let him put his name on a blueprint. That notebook sat in a supply closet in my office for who knows how long, nearly thrown out as trash this very morning, before Ms. Ellison found it, and before she had the courage to walk into a room full of people who'd never once asked for her opinion, and tell us we were about to make a very public, very dangerous mistake." The crowd had gone almost completely silent now, save for the wind and the distant hum of traffic on the parallel road. Maren felt every eye in the vicinity swing toward her, the navy blazer suddenly feeling less like a disguise and more like a spotlight. "I've spent 30 years building this firm on the assumption that expertise only comes with a diploma attached to it," Callahan said. "This morning, I learned how wrong that assumption has been. And I think it's long past time this industry, my firm certainly, starting today, stopped ignoring people simply because their knowledge didn't arrive wrapped in the right paperwork." He turned, extending a hand toward the crowd, toward Maren specifically, in a gesture that felt less like ceremony and more like an accounting finally being settled. "Ms. Ellison, would you come up here, please?" For a moment, Maren didn't move. Every instinct she'd built over 6 years of invisibility told her to stay exactly where she was, to let this moment pass her by, the way every other moment of possible recognition had passed her by, quietly, without incident. But then she thought of her grandfather, of lantern light on a porch in Ohio, of a man who'd spent his whole life being told to stay quiet, to stay in the background, to accept that his understanding of the world, hard-won, self-taught, real, simply didn't count, because nobody official had signed off on it. She thought about her daughter, 12 years old, waiting at home, who had never once seen her mother be anything other than tired and invisible, and quietly, permanently underestimated. Maren walked forward. The crowd parted for her, the way crowds part for people they don't yet know how to categorize, with a mixture of curiosity and hesitant respect, murmurs rising and falling as she made her way to the stage. She climbed the steps, and Callahan met her at the top, extending his hand not for a photograph, but for an actual handshake, firm and deliberate, the kind that said, "I see you more clearly than any speech could." "Would you like to say anything?" he asked, quiet, just for her. Maren looked out at the crowd, hundreds of strangers, a mayor, 2 senators, cameras with lenses like small black eyes, trained directly on her. And for a moment, the old fear rose up in her chest, the fear of being laughed at, dismissed, told she didn't belong in a room like this one. But underneath it, steadier now, was something else. Something her grandfather had spent a lifetime trying to teach her, in workshops and on porches, and over notebooks full of numbers nobody wanted to read. She stepped toward the podium. "My grandfather used to tell me that a bridge doesn't lie to you," she said, her voice shaking only slightly before it found its footing. "It tells you exactly what's wrong, if you're willing to listen. I think that's true about people too." She looked out at the crowd, found Preston Voss standing near the front, his expression unreadable, and held his gaze for just a moment before continuing. "There are a lot of people in this world who understand things deeply, who've earned real knowledge the hard way, through years of watching and doing and getting it wrong until they got it right, who never get asked what they know, because nobody bothers to look past the uniform they're wearing when they walk into a room. My grandfather was one of those people. He died without ever getting the credit he deserved for the things he understood." She glanced down at the notebook still clutched in her hand, its cracked leather cover catching the afternoon light. "I'm not standing up here for myself. I'm standing up here for him and for anyone else out there who's ever been told they don't count because their expertise didn't come with the right piece of paper attached to it." The applause that followed wasn't polite. It wasn't the scattered, obligatory kind reserved for minor ceremony detours. It rolled through the crowd in a genuine wave, swelling as it went, and somewhere in the middle of it, Maren caught sight of Devon clapping hardest of anyone, grinning like he'd just watched something he'd remember for the rest of his career. The press swarmed Maren the moment she stepped down from the podium, a wall of microphones and shouted questions closing in faster than she knew how to process. "Ms. Ellison, how long have you worked at the firm? Did you always know your grandfather's notes were valuable? Is it true you were nearly fired this morning?" That last question came from a reporter she didn't recognize, and it landed with a strange, disorienting sting. She hadn't been nearly fired. She'd been nearly invisible, which felt like a different kind of danger entirely, one nobody in this crowd seemed equipped to ask about. Callahan stepped in before she had to answer any of it, a hand at her elbow, steering her gently but firmly toward the sight trailer, away from the cameras. "You don't owe them anything today," he said. "We'll do this properly, on your terms, when you're ready." "Not like this." Inside the trailer, the noise dulled to a muffled roar against the metal walls, and Maren finally let her shoulders drop, the adrenaline of the last 6 hours draining out of her all at once, leaving something closer to exhaustion in its place. She sat heavily in a folding chair, the notebook still in her lap, and for a moment she just stared at it, at the cracked leather, at her grandfather's initials worn nearly smooth from decades of handling. He would have hated all that, she said quietly. The cameras! The applause! He never wanted credit. He just wanted to be right, and to be listened to. Those weren't the same thing to him. They rarely are, for people like him, Callahan said, settling into the chair across from her. I mean that as a compliment, for what it's worth. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. 3 missed calls, all from the same number, her daughter's middle school. Maren's stomach dropped before she even opened the message. Old habits of single motherhood kicking in fast, until she saw the actual text and felt the fear dissolve into something warmer, stranger. Mum, everyone's talking about you at school. Is this you on the news? Are you okay? Call me, she laughed. A short, startled sound, the first real laugh she'd allowed herself all day. My daughter, she said, by way of explanation, when she caught Callahan watching her. Lily, 12 years old. Apparently the entire 7th grade has stronger internet access than I realized. Go home to her, Callahan said. Today's done what it needed to do. The rest can wait until tomorrow. But the rest, as it turned out, did not wait quietly. By the time Maren picked Lily up from school, early, unable to focus on anything else once she knew her daughter had spent the afternoon fielding questions from classmates who'd seen her mother on the local news, the story had already climbed well past local coverage. A national outlet had picked up the footage of Callahan's speech, clipped down to 90 seconds, captioned something like, "Cleaning woman's grandfather's notebook saves bridge from collapse." It wasn't quite accurate, nothing ever was, once it passed through enough hands, but it was close enough, and it was spreading fast. Lily climbed into the passenger seat with the particular electric energy of a preteen who has just watched her quiet, tired mother become, however briefly, famous. Mum, you're literally trending. Some guy at school showed me a video with like 200,000 views. I don't know what that means, Maren admitted, pulling out of the school lot. It means a lot of people watched it, Mom. Lily was scrolling through her phone, narrating headlines as they passed. Local janitor uncovers hidden structural genius. Okay, that one's kind of insulting. You're not a janitor, you're a... Wait, what do you actually do, like, job title-wise? Building maintenance, Maren said. And apparently, structural consulting, as of about 6 hours ago. Lily laughed, delighted, and for a moment, the whole strange, overwhelming day compressed down into something manageable. Just a mother and daughter in a car, one of them scrolling too fast through headlines, the other trying to remember how to just drive home like it was any other Tuesday. It wasn't, though. Not entirely, because 3 miles from their apartment, Maren's phone rang again. This time a number she didn't recognize. A local area code but no name attached. She almost let it go to voicemail. Instead, something made her answer. Ms. Ellison. This is Diane Ferris. I'm a producer with... The voice rattled off a national morning show Maren had watched a handful of times, years ago, back when she'd had time to watch television in the mornings. We'd love to have you on the program this week, if you're willing. And your story is really resonating with people. The idea of overlooked expertise, generational knowledge, the whole, it's a powerful narrative. Maren glanced at Lily, who had gone very still in the passenger seat, clearly listening, clearly hoping. Can I think about it? Maren said. Of course. Take your time. A pause. Can I ask, is it true the young engineer who mocked the notebook this morning is the same one who signed off on the original faulty model? Maren felt something go tight in her chest. I'd rather not speak to that. Understood. Understood. We'll follow up tomorrow. She hung up, and the silence in the car stretched a beat too long before Lily broke it. They wanted to know about the guy who was mean to you. Preston, right? Is he in trouble? I don't know, Maren said honestly, and she realized, turning the question over, that she genuinely didn't know how she felt about it either. Preston Voss had spent 6 years walking past her like she was furniture. He'd humiliated her that very morning, dropped her grandfather's life's work into her lap like garbage. Some old, tired, familiar part of her wanted to see him lose everything he'd built on the back of that arrogance. But another part of her, the part her grandfather had raised, the part that remembered exactly what it felt like to be dismissed by people who had power over your livelihood, didn't want to become the very thing that had been done to her family for 2 generations. Public humiliation wasn't justice. It was just a different flavor of cruelty, dressed up in the satisfaction of watching someone else fall. She didn't know yet what she wanted to happen to Preston Voss, but she knew, with a clarity that surprised her, that whatever came next needed to be about more than revenge. Back at the firm, in an office 3 floors above, where Maren had once pushed her cart through empty hallways at 4 in the morning, Preston sat alone at his desk, long after the rest of the staff had gone home, the city lights blinking on outside his window one by one. He'd pulled every archived project file he could find, with William Ellison's name attached to it. Subcontractor logs, old inspection reports, a decades-old union roster from a bridge project in Oregon that had nearly ended in disaster before a foreman, with no formal license, caught an error the licensed engineer of record had missed. The name on that engineer's report, the one who'd taken credit for the correction, who'd built an entire career on a fix he hadn't actually devised, made something cold settle in Preston's stomach. It was a name he recognized. A name still listed, decades later, in the framed photographs lining the hallway outside his own office. One of the firm's founding partners, memorialized in brass and polished glass, celebrated for exactly the kind of quiet, uncredited theft that Preston himself had nearly repeated that very morning, without even realizing it was a pattern with a history. He sat back in his chair, the old file glowing on his monitor, and understood, with a discomfort that felt entirely new to him, that the notebook in Maren Ellison's hands wasn't just a lucky discovery. It was evidence of something this firm had been doing to people like William Ellison for far longer than one bad morning. Preston didn't sleep that night. He sat with the archived file until well past midnight, reading and rereading the Oregon inspection report until the words blurred, until the name attached to the corrected structural fix, Harold Voss, his own father's father, the man whose portrait hung in gold-leaf frame outside the executive conference room, stopped looking like a legacy and started looking like something closer to a theft with good PR. He found the original incident report buried 3 folders deep, filed under a project number instead of a name, the way things got filed when someone wanted them technically preserved but practically forgotten. William Ellison's name appeared exactly twice, once as foreman non-licensed, flagging the rebar spacing error that would have caused a partial collapse during the initial concrete pour, and once in a terse addendum noting his informal consultation had been incorporated into the final engineering correction, a correction that Harold Voss had then submitted, under his own name and license number, to the State Inspection Board. No mention of Ellison in the commendation that followed. No mention of him in the plaque that still hung, 40 years later, in the lobby of a bridge 200 miles north, crediting Harold Voss with averting a structural disaster through his keen engineering instincts. Preston sat with that for a long time. He thought about his father, who had built half his identity on being Harold Voss's son, who had drilled into Preston from childhood that the Voss name meant something in this industry, that it carried weight, earned through generations of genuine expertise. He thought about his own Cornell degree, framed on his office wall, the diploma he'd worked genuinely hard for, genuinely earned, and how none of that hard work erased the fact that the foundation his family's reputation was built on had, apparently, been laid using someone else's uncredited labor. By morning, he had made a decision he wasn't entirely sure he had the courage to follow through on. He found Maren in the building lobby just past 7, back in her grey uniform despite everything. Old habits, she'd tell him later. And besides, Callahan hadn't gotten around to figuring out what her actual job title should be yet. She was refilling a soap dispenser near the elevator bank when Preston approached, moving with none of his usual confident stride, hands shoved awkwardly in his pockets, like a man who'd forgotten how to occupy space normally. "I need to show you something," he said, "and I need to apologize for something a lot bigger than yesterday morning." He led her up to his office, the file still open on his monitor, and watched her face as she read through the Oregon report. Watched the exact moment recognition hit her, the way her jaw tightened, the way her hand went, unconsciously, to the notebook she now carried everywhere. "Harold Voss," she said quietly. "My grandfather mentioned that name. Not often. He didn't like talking about Oregon much. I always thought it was because of how close the bridge came to failing." She looked up at Preston. "I didn't know someone took credit for his fix." "I didn't either," Preston said. "Not until last night. He's my grandfather. This firm, my family's name on it. It's partly built on crediting itself for work your grandfather actually did." He exhaled, something raw in it. "I spent my whole career thinking I inherited a reputation for excellence. Turns out, I inherited a habit of taking other people's excellence and putting my family's name on it. I did the same thing to you yesterday morning, without even realizing it was a pattern. I looked at that notebook and saw trash because I'd been trained, my entire life, to only recognize expertise when it comes wrapped in the right credentials." Maren didn't say anything for a long moment, turning the information over, feeling old anger and new understanding sit uneasily, side by side in her chest. "What are you going to do with this?" "I don't know yet," Preston admitted. "I thought about burying it. I'm not going to pretend that thought didn't cross my mind. It would be easier, cleaner, and nobody would ever know. But I watched you stand in that lobby yesterday and tell a room full of people something true, even though every instinct in the room was telling you to stay quiet. I don't think I can look at that and then go bury the truth about my own family because it's inconvenient. So what then?" "I want to bring it to Callahan," Preston said. "Publicly, if you're willing to be part of it. Not as some kind of stunt. I don't want this to look like I'm riding your story for redemption points. But I think this firm needs to actually reckon with this, not just celebrate yesterday and move on like nothing deeper is broken here." Maren studied him for a long moment. This man who 24 hours earlier had dropped her grandfather's life's work into her lap like it was garbage, who had built a career on inherited assumptions he'd never once questioned until they collapsed under him overnight. She thought about grace. Real grace. The kind her grandfather had modeled his entire life. Not the performative kind that made a room feel good about itself, but the kind that made room for people to actually change. "I don't need you to punish yourself for this," she said finally. "That's not going to fix anything, and honestly, it's not really about you. It's about my grandfather finally getting the credit he should have had 40 years ago. If you're serious about that, if this isn't about making yourself feel less guilty, then yes, bring it to Callahan. Let's do it right." Relief moved visibly through Preston's shoulders, though it was tempered, careful, like a man who understood he hadn't earned the easy version of forgiveness and wasn't going to pretend otherwise. "Thank you," he said, "for not just writing me off completely. Ask me again in a month," Maren said, not unkindly. "Words are easy." "I'd rather see what you actually do next." It was, Preston thought, exactly the kind of answer his grandfather's report had never allowed William Ellison the dignity of giving. a chance to be judged by his actual actions over time, rather than dismissed in a single sentence and filed away under a project number. They took the file to Callahan together that afternoon. Maren watched Callahan's expression harden as he read through it, watched 30 years of pride in his firm's history curdle slightly at the edges, watched him rub a hand over his face, the way men do when a myth they've built their identity around turns out to have an ugly asterisk attached to it. "This changes things," Callahan said finally, quiet, more to himself than to either of them. "This changes a lot of things." He looked up at Maren, and then at Preston, and something settled behind his eyes. Not just decision, but resolve, the particular clarity of a man who had spent one morning already learning how wrong his assumptions could be, and had decided he wasn't interested in repeating that mistake twice in the same week. "We're going to fix this," he said, "properly, publicly, starting with your grandfather's name on that Oregon Bridge plaque, and ending with something that makes sure this firm never lets a mistake like this happen quietly again." The plan Callahan proposed moved faster than Maren expected, though she'd come to learn, over the past 2 days, that this was simply how the man operated, decisively, once he'd made up his mind, with none of the hedging or committee forming she'd assumed powerful people used to avoid responsibility. Within 48 hours, he'd assembled a small internal team, pulled the Oregon file into full daylight, and personally called the State Engineering Board to begin the process of formally amending the historical record. A process, his legal counsel warned him, that would likely take months, possibly longer, and would almost certainly invite uncomfortable press scrutiny of the firm's founding history. "Let it invite whatever it invites," Callahan said, in the meeting where Maren first heard him say it. "We've spent 30 years building a reputation on being the best in this industry. That reputation doesn't mean anything if it's sitting on top of somebody else's uncredited work." Preston, to his credit, didn't disappear into the background once the harder, less glamorous work began. He spent long hours in the archive with Devon, cross-referencing every project his grandfather had ever touched, checking for other names that might have been quietly erased from other files, other plaques, other quiet corrections filed under project numbers instead of people. It wasn't redemption. Maren was careful, in her own mind, not to call it that, not yet. But it was work, consistent and unglamorous, the kind that didn't make headlines and didn't need to. They found 2 more names in the process. A drafting technician in the 90s whose load calculations had quietly saved a parking structure from a foundation failure, credited instead to the engineer of record. A young female engineer, forced out of the firm in the early 2000s, after raising safety concerns that were later fixed and patented under someone else's name entirely, without her knowledge. Callahan tracked down both of them personally, the technician now retired in Florida, the engineer now running her own successful firm 3 states away, and issued corrections, apologies, and in the engineer's case, a substantial settlement that came with no strings attached, beyond an acknowledgement, finally, in writing, of what had actually happened. "This is bigger than my grandfather's notebook," Maren said to Callahan, one evening, the two of them going over documents in his office long after the rest of the building had emptied out. "How long has this been happening here?" "Longer than I want to admit," Callahan said. "I built this firm with my old partner Harold 30 years ago. I knew him as a genius. I never once thought to ask whose genius he might have been borrowing." He set down the file he'd been holding, rubbing his eyes, looking older in that moment than Maren had seen him look yet. "I think a lot of institutions like this one get built the same way. Good intentions on the surface, and underneath, decades of quiet theft from people who never had the standing to fight back. It took a bridge almost falling down for me to actually look underneath mine." Lily, meanwhile, had become something of a minor celebrity at school. "My mum's the bridge lady," she announced with unearned confidence to anyone who'd listen. And Maren found herself, for the first time in years, having long conversations with her daughter about her own father, about the grandfather Lily had never met, about a man who'd spent a lifetime being told his knowledge didn't count. "Why didn't you ever tell me all this before?" Lily asked one night. The notebook spread open between them on the kitchen table, Lily's fingers tracing the same cramped, careful handwriting Maren had grown up memorizing. "I don't know," Maren admitted. "I think some part of me believed, if nobody else thought it mattered, maybe it didn't. It's easier to protect something by keeping it quiet than to risk somebody laughing at it." "That's kind of sad, Mom." "Yeah," Maren said, surprising herself with how easily the admission came. "It is." 2 weeks after the bridge ceremony, Callahan called Maren into his office for what he described, cryptically, as a conversation about your future here. She arrived expecting some version of a formal thank you, maybe a modest raise, a plaque of her own perhaps, tucked somewhere less visible than her grandfather's would eventually be. What she got instead was an offer that made her sit back in her chair, stunned into silence for the first time in the entire ordeal. "I want to create a position," Callahan said, "specifically for you. Not consultant, not some symbolic title we slap on you for the sake of good press. A real role, Director of Field Engineering Review. You'd work directly with our licensed teams, cross-checking projects against the kind of practical, field-tested knowledge that doesn't always show up in modern software models. Full salary befitting the position, full benefits, and, if you're willing, I'd like your grandfather's methodology, properly credited, properly documented, taught as part of our internal training program going forward." Maren was quiet for a long moment, turning the offer over, feeling the shape of it settle against everything she'd believed about her own worth for the past 6 years. Everything the world had quietly taught her to expect from rooms like this one. "I don't have a degree," she said finally. "I don't have a license. I don't have any of the paperwork that usually comes with a title like that." "Neither did your grandfather," Callahan said. "And he was better at this than most of the licensed engineers I've worked with in 30 years. I'm not interested in repeating my industry's oldest mistake. If the last 2 weeks have taught me anything, it's that credentials and expertise aren't always the same thing, and this firm is done pretending otherwise." Maren thought about her grandfather, about lantern light and porch steps, and a man who'd spent his whole life being told, gently or cruelly, that he didn't belong in rooms exactly like this one. She thought about Lily, waiting at home, about to learn that her mother's quiet, careful, self-taught expertise had finally, after 30 years of being denied to one Ellison, been offered to another. "I'll take it," Maren said. "On one condition." Callahan raised an eyebrow, waiting. "The notebook goes in a case," she said. "Somewhere visible, not locked in an archive somewhere, forgotten the way it almost was. I want every person who walks through this lobby to see it and understand exactly what almost got thrown away." "Done," Callahan said, without hesitation. "I think that's exactly where it belongs." The following month brought a small, quiet ceremony back at the Ashgrove Bridge. No senators this time, no press cordons, just a modest gathering of firm employees, a handful of local reporters who'd stayed genuinely invested in the story rather than chasing the next viral clip, and a new plaque being mounted beside the original dedication marker at the bridge's northern approach. Maren stood beside Callahan as the covering cloth came off, revealing bronze lettering that read, "In recognition of William Ellison, whose self-taught structural insight prevented catastrophic failure of the original 1987 support design. His expertise, though never formally credentialed, exceeded that of many who were. This firm failed to credit him in his lifetime. We do so now, with gratitude and with apology." Lily stood on Maren's other side, dressed in her one nice dress, holding her mother's hand tightly as the small crowd applauded. It wasn't the roaring, cinematic applause of the ribbon-cutting ceremony weeks earlier. It was quieter, steadier. The kind of applause that came from people who understood exactly what they were witnessing wasn't a viral moment, but a correction 30 years overdue. He would have hated the fuss, Merrin said to Callahan, watching Lily trace her fingers over the raised bronze letters of her great-grandfather's name. Probably, Callahan agreed, but I don't think this is really for him. I think it's for the next person like him, the next Ellison, the next foreman or technician or cleaning woman who knows something true and doesn't feel like anyone will listen. This plaque tells them somebody finally did. The firm's changes hadn't stopped at the plaque. Over the following weeks, Callahan had formalized what he'd started calling, somewhat awkwardly at first, the Ellison Review Protocol, a standing internal policy requiring every major structural project to undergo a secondary review process that explicitly welcomed input from field staff, technicians, and non-credentialed workers who often had hands-on, practical knowledge that theoretical models sometimes missed. It wasn't glamorous. It wouldn't make headlines the way the bridge story had, but Devon, now heading up the review board at only 2 years into his career, had told Merrin it was already catching things, small things, mostly. Nothing as dramatic as a resonance fracture, but real things nonetheless, the kind of quiet errors that used to slip through simply because nobody thought to ask the person who actually swept the floors or ran the equipment what they'd noticed. Preston had been assigned to the review board too, not as its head, but as a working member, a demotion of sorts, though he never once complained about it, and Merrin had noticed, in the weeks since, a genuine shift in how he carried himself in meetings. Less certainty, more questions. He'd started, awkwardly at first, asking maintenance staff and junior technicians for their observations before finalizing his own assessments, a habit that clearly didn't come naturally to him yet, but one he was practicing with the visible discipline of a man trying to unlearn 31 years of inherited assumption. I looked up my grandfather's other projects, he told Merrin one afternoon, catching her in the break room where she now took her lunch, instead of eating alone in the supply closet the way she used to. There's a retirement home upstate, built in the early 90s. I think there might be another uncredited fix buried in that file too. I haven't confirmed it yet, but I wanted you to know I'm still looking. Good, Merrin said simply, and meant it. At home, the changes were smaller, but no less significant. Marin's new salary as Director of Field Engineering Review meant she no longer needed the second part-time cleaning job she'd quietly held at a dental office 3 evenings a week, work Lily hadn't even known about until Merrin mentioned, almost offhand, that she wouldn't be going in anymore. Lily had cried a little at that, in the surprised, relieved way of a child who'd absorbed more of her mother's exhaustion over the years than either of them had ever discussed out loud. "You're going to be home more," Lily said, like she was testing the sentence for truth. "I'm going to be home more," Merrin confirmed. They spent that first free evening together at the kitchen table, the notebook between them again, though this time Merrin pulled out a second, blank notebook too, a gift from Callahan, leather-bound, nearly identical in size to her grandfather's, though the leather was still stiff and new, not yet softened by decades of handling. "What's that for?" Lily asked. "I've been thinking," Merrin said, running her thumb along the blank spine, "that your great-grandfather wasn't wrong to write everything down, even when he didn't think anyone would read it. I think I want to do the same, not just the engineering stuff, everything. What I've learned about being underestimated. What I've learned about proving yourself in rooms that don't want you there. What I've learned about grace, too, about not becoming as small and unkind as the people who were unkind to you." "Are you going to give it to me someday?" Lily asked. "Like he gave his to you? If you want it," Merrin said. "Or maybe you'll write your own, and this one will just sit next to it, so whoever comes after both of us has 2 voices instead of 1. Lily considered this with the particular seriousness of a 12-year-old encountering a genuinely new idea. "I like that," she said finally. It's like nobody has to be the only one who figures things out alone. Maren smiled, something in her chest loosening in a way it hadn't in longer than she could easily remember. No, she agreed. Nobody should have to be. 6 months later, the offer came in a plain envelope, hand-delivered to Maren's new office by Callahan himself. An office that had, until recently, been a storage room on the 3rd floor, repurposed with her name on the door in simple black lettering. M. Ellison, Director of Field Engineering Review. Inside the envelope was a proposal from the firm's board, a formal award ceremony, a 6-figure bonus, and, the part that made Maren actually laugh out loud, a request that she allow the firm to name the entire downtown engineering wing after her grandfather, complete with a life-sized bronze statue in the atrium. "They want to put me in bronze," she told Callahan, sliding the paper back across the desk. "I don't know what to do with that." "You don't have to do anything with it," Callahan said. "You can say no." "I want to say no," Maren said, and felt, saying it, the particular relief of a decision that had been obvious the moment she considered it honestly. A statue doesn't help anybody. My grandfather didn't need a statue. He needed somebody to listen to him while he was alive. So, what do you want instead? Maren had already thought about this, in the quiet weeks since the bridge ceremony, turning the question over the way she used to turn over her grandfather's equations, looking for the elegant answer instead of the obvious one. "I want a fund," she said. "Small scholarships, not for engineering school necessarily, though that too, for anyone in this company, or applying to work here, who's spent years doing real, hands-on work, without the credentials to back it up on paper. Trade certifications, night classes. Whatever it takes for somebody like my grandfather to finally get the paperwork that would have let the world take him seriously, if he'd wanted it. And I want the review protocol Devon's running made permanent, not a policy that quietly disappears in 5 years once everybody's forgotten why we started it." Callahan studied her for a long moment, something like genuine admiration settling into his expression. "That's it? No bonus? No statue? No wing named after you?" "That's it," Maren said. "Name the scholarship fund after him, if you want to put a name on something. The William Ellison Fund for Field Expertise. That's enough." It became enough, and more. Within a year, the fund had helped 14 employees across 3 of the firm's regional offices pursue certifications and training they'd never had the resources to chase on their own. A concrete finisher who became a licensed inspector, a maintenance supervisor who finally earned the engineering credential he'd been quietly capable of for a decade, a young single mother in the mailroom who used the fund to finish the drafting degree she'd put on hold twice already. Devon's review protocol, formally renamed the Ellison Protocol at Callahan's insistence over Maren's mild objection, became standard practice not just at Callahan and Voss, but was eventually adopted, in modified form, by 2 other regional firms after industry press coverage of the Ashgrove Bridge incident made its way into engineering trade publications. Preston stayed on the review board for 2 years before eventually leaving to start his own smaller firm. One built, he told Maren before he left, on the explicit principle of crediting every contributor by name, regardless of what letters followed it. He sent her an invitation to the opening, and she went and stood at the back of a much smaller, much humbler ceremony than the one that had first brought them together, and felt something like closure settle quietly into place. 5 years passed the way years tend to, quickly in memory, slowly in the living of them. Lily graduated high school with a growing interest in structural engineering herself, a fact that surprised no one who'd watched her grow up around 2 overlapping notebooks on the kitchen table, one worn soft with age, one gradually filling with her mother's careful, steady handwriting. The Ashgrove Bridge still stood, its cables catching the light exactly the way they had on the day it nearly wasn't there to catch anything at all. The plaque at its northern approach had weathered slightly, the bronze taking on the soft patina of 5 winters, though the words remained perfectly legible to anyone who stopped to read them, which people still did, more often than Marin had ever expected, tourists and locals alike pausing at the rail to read about a self-taught man whose knowledge had once nearly gone in the trash. Marin still kept both notebooks in a glass case in the Callahan and Voss lobby, exactly where she'd asked for them to be placed, visible to every employee who walked through those doors each morning. Not hidden in an archive, not locked away in some executive's private collection, but sitting in plain sight, a permanent reminder of the day this firm had almost missed the most important thing in the room. She thought often about her grandfather on the porch, lantern light on his weathered hands, teaching an 11-year-old girl to listen for the things a bridge doesn't say out loud. She thought about how long she'd carried his knowledge quietly, believing, the way he had believed for most of his own life, that some truths simply don't count unless somebody official says they do. She knew better now, and so, she hoped, did everyone who'd ever walked past that glass case in the lobby and stopped, however briefly, to read the names of two people, one who never got the chance to be believed, and one who finally was. If there's one thing this story asks you to carry with you, let it be this. The world is full of people quietly holding real knowledge nobody has bothered to ask about. The janitor who understands the building better than the architects who designed it. The grandmother who could have been a scientist in another life. The quiet co-worker everyone talks over in every meeting. You don't need permission or paperwork to be worth listening to. Sometimes the only thing standing between overlooked and understood is somebody brave enough to finally speak up, and somebody else humble enough to finally listen.